So yeah, I'm the Peatland Code coordinator for IUCN UK Peatland program. You probably all know this, but just so we're all on the same level, why do we even need the Peatland Code? What is it with peatlands? So 10% of the UK is actually covered in peatlands, so that's a really large area. Peatlands store a massive amount of carbon, but unfortunately 80% of the peatlands in the UK are in a modified or damaged state. We desperately need to fix this, and to be able to do that, to do it at the scale and the urgency that we need it to happen, public finance is not enough. So we need private investment to come into this as well. Very quickly, intact peatlands, healthy peatlands, they are a net carbon sink. So they store carbon over a long time. So you'd sometimes get meters and meters of peat stored in these systems, and it's all carbon, obviously. However, if we degrade them, you lower your water table, you get that carbon store to the atmosphere. You are releasing a lot of greenhouse gases. Luckily, not all is lost with that. So we can actually restore our peatlands. We can block our dams. We can reprofile, revegetate, do all sorts of things to our peatlands to make them healthy again. Eventually, is obviously the main goal. So we want to raise the water table, and when you raise the water table in a peatland, actually really quickly you stop a vast amount of your emissions almost instantly. So that's the main thing what we want to do. We want to raise the water table and stabilize, obviously, peatlands. So that's where the Peatlands Code then comes in. So the Peatlands Code is a voluntary certification standard to attract private funding for peatland restoration projects in exchange for climate benefits by providing assurance to the buyers. So it's a project that's developed and managed by the IUCN UK Peatland program. It's about UK-based peatlands, and also for the offsets, it's UK-based emissions only. It's about emission reductions, and it's not about carbon that's already stored in the peatlands, because that's not additional, and I come to the additionality issues later on. And we've got a number of eligibility criteria and legal and financial tests as well. I'll explain about them later on. So just a bit of background on the Peatlands Code. So in 2011, there was a DEFRA report on the whole idea of the Peatlands Code with emission factors, and that's where it all started, basically. Then there were a few pilot projects, and in 2015 at the World Forum on Natural Capital, the Peatlands Code was officially launched. So we're almost 6 years old now. Our first validated project was a dry hop, and that was in 2018. And at the end of last year, we've joined the Woodland Carbon Code to create a UK land carbon registry on IHS market. So that has now massively improved the transparency of Peatland Code projects and where carbon units are and who they belong to. So the Peatland Code obviously is about selling carbon units, and to be able to sell carbon units, you need buyer confidence. So it's really important that we are government backed. And you can see that, like the Peatland Code is mentioned, for example, in the government's net zero strategy that came out last week. We've got government funding into places of the code as well. Scotland's climate change plan massively also mentioned the code. In the UK government's environmental reporting guidelines, those are guidelines of 12,000 large companies that have to report their emissions. So they don't have to reduce, but they have to report their emissions. And in there, it shows that those companies can use peatland carbon units as well. So that's obviously really important, because that's how companies can reduce their net emissions, basically. And the transparency is really important for buyer confidence as well. So that's where that market registry I just mentioned really helps, because on there's all our units are. You can see all our units. They all have an individual serial number. And you have to assign them to whoever owns them or makes claims on them, basically. So that was on the background. So now let's get stuck into how the code actually works. So the Peatland Code, we use 4 different condition categories. So from the worst at the bottom, actively eroding is divided into actively eroding flat bare area or actively eroding hags and gullies. Then the next up is the drained area. So the drained part, a hag or gully has a drainage effect, and also an artificial drain obviously has a drainage effect on your peatland. And then the next up is modified and near natural. So all these condition categories have an emission factor associated with them, and in the code we assume that you only go 1 step change in condition category. So if you start on actively eroding, you will only go into drained. Drained will only go into modified initially, and that's to do with that we cannot oversell any carbon units. So we need to be confident that at least that minimum change in condition category and thus in emission reductions will definitely happen. If at any future point it is clear that a project actually has moved to another condition category, more carbon units can be issued at that point. This is just to show what kind of data, what kind of numbers are went into the emission factors. So we take into account methane, CO2, nitrous oxide, but also dissolved organic carbon and particulate organic carbon. So that's all these. So CH4 is methane, CO2, carbon dioxide, and all of that. So at the moment, actually, our emission factors are being updated to the latest scientific evidence by CH scientists. So we will have hopefully also more condition categories soon, as well as fence soon, as well as the idea. But here you can see that actively eroding, for example, has an emission factor of almost 24 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year, and a drained area of 4.54. So if you move from actively eroding to the drained area, you save about 19 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. So that's how that then relates into carbon units. So this is roughly the same, but then visualized. So you see actually only a naturally functioning peatland here is actually sequestering some net carbon in like on the net basis. So peatlands are really good at locking in CO2, but they only lock in a little bit of CO2 every year. So it's that time scale that's really important there. And that this also shows that why we are about emission reductions, because actually because only the actively eroding and the drained categories are eligible as a baseline, you will only move into modified by BESS initially. And then you can see you're still a net emitter, although you're doing a lot better than you were before. So I've mentioned actively eroding. What does that actually look like when you look at your peatlands? So these are examples of hags and gullies. So you can see on the left, that's like that really quite deep draining gully there with lots of bare peats on the side, and on the right is where you've got an aerial of a vast hag and gully system there. Actively eroding flat bare is obviously where you've got no actual vertical hags or gullies, but there's a lot of bare peat on a flat area, and that's just some examples of how that looks like. The drained artificial, so these are on the right, you see an artificial dark drain, and then we buffer an area basically around our drains. We say about 30 meters of around a drain is where the drain has an actively draining effect. In practice, usually that is much bigger, that area, but we have to be absolutely certain that the emission reductions we are selling are there and are real. So therefore we've got quite a conservative buffer area around our drains. And on the left you can see an aerial of drains. So this is the same as earlier, the Hagg and Gully system, but then you, just to say that we also have that 30-meter buffer around Haggs and Gullies because they have also a similar draining effect. Modified is where we then have an area with no or little sphagnum, quite a lot of heather, small patches of erosion, that kind of system we're looking at. And near natural is where you have a lot of sphagnum, not much or any heather either. So that's all about blanket bogs. Obviously, blanket and raised bogs is what we're talking about. So just very briefly, how does the Peatland Code works? So initially, you need to register your project on the UK Land Carbon Registry under the Peatland Code. And to be able to do that, the first step, actually, I forgot to put in here, is you need to have an account on the UK Land Carbon Registry as a project developer. And then you can register your project. Then you need to go initially for project validation. So that's where you go out and do your mapping. So we've got a field protocol to follow on how you need to map all your drainage features, your linear features, your eroding features, and all of that. That will then give you a hectareage of those different condition categories. And you can plug them into our emission calculator, and that then shows you how many emission reductions or carbon units you will get in the end. You will need to fill in our additionality calculator, and you need to fill in the risk assessment, and you need to write a restoration plan. That then all goes to a third-party independent validator, and they assess the project, and they check that indeed, if you're going to do what you say you're going to do, that the project will result in emission reductions, in the expected emission reductions. If that's all signed off, then you can get all your pending issuance units issued at that point. So for the whole project duration. So if you need to raise any capital, any money to actually do the restoration work, you can already forward sell these pending issuance units if you want to. You can also hold on to them and sell them later on if you want. Then you go and do your restoration. And then within 1 year of finishing your restoration, you need to get your restoration validated. So that's again an assessment of the independent validator. At this point, they call on site, and they check that you indeed did what you said you were going to do, that all your dams are holding up and all of that. And if that's all in place, you get your restoration validation certificate. And then at year 5, after finishing restoration, is when your first verification happens. And that's, again, the independent auditor comes on site. They check that your site is indeed moving indeed in the next condition category, and they're looking for any risks for reversal. So they're checking, for example, is there a lot of deer evidence? Is there erosion starting to happen again, or is it all looking in order? If it's all in order, you get your units, your pending issuance units from year 0 to year 5 converted into verified units. At that point, we are certain that the emission reductions have happened, and that's why they're verified. And then every 10 years is when when verification happens. So this is just to show you similar, but then also to include what happens next. So initially, you've got your project, your validation, verification, and then you can then sell them either via broker, you can sell them directly to corporate, and the end user then makes offset claims on them and they retire the units. So like I mentioned, we've joined the UK Land Carbon Registry on IHS Market, and all of these steps I've just mentioned, they all happen in our market registry. So that's why you need to set up your project. That's why you add your documents. That's why the units are issued. And you can actually go onto our registry, and I'll show you an example later. But you can look for the documents for validated projects, for example. So you can see what they've done and how many units they have as well. So it's really also helped in the transparency and avoidance of double counting, and also the traceability of our units. So that's really important. So this is just a screenshot of what that registry looks like. So you can see our project, you can see who's the project developer, who's the validator, And then if you click on details, you can see, especially for the validated projects, you can see the project design documents, for example, like there's carbon calculations, maps, and validation statements. So what kind of activities are eligible under the code? So the peatland types that are eligible at the moment is blanket bog and raised bog. So we're hoping to get a version 2 update of the code at the start of next year, and then fens will be included as well. So the baseline condition categories that are eligible are actively eroding and or drained. You need to have a minimum peat depth of 50 centimeters. Your restoration and management activities cannot conflict with any existing land management agreements. Your restoration activities can be revegetating, reprofiling, and re-wetting. And you have to maintain or enhance your condition category change. So those are the really important things. So minimum project duration for Peatland Code project is 30 years. And the maximum depends on your peat depth and obviously on how long you want it, if you want it longer or not. So as a really broad rule of thumb, we're saying that what you lose about 1 centimeter of peat depth a year in an eroding peatland. So if you, for example, have a meter of peat, and after 100 years, you would not have any peat left. That would be completely eroded and gone. Because we are claiming and selling emission reductions, you cannot claim that after that 100 years then, you would have reduced any emissions from that peatland, because that peatland would not have emitted anymore because it would have been gone. So that's how we come to the maximum length of our projects. Eligible land. So you need to demonstrate legal ownership or tenure for the project area. So tenure, if you are on the tenure, then you need to have tenure for the full project duration. You need to have the landowner permission, and you need the landowner agreement to take over the delivery should tenancy end prior to project conclusion. Unfortunately, legally, carbon units belong to the landowner. So that's not to say that a landowner, that you cannot come on to an agreement between the tenant and the landowner to split or to hand them over, but legally they do belong to the landowner. And the really important thing is that you cannot have any activity done on your land to drain or remove vegetation since November 2015. So that's when the code was launched. So obviously, otherwise someone could drain today and then claim carbon units for it tomorrow. So that's to make sure that that cannot happen. So you need to you also need to undertake a consultation. So you need to identify relevant stakeholders, notify them, consult them, so show them proposals that are available for feedback. You need to record the outcome for that. And obviously any action taken to mitigate any identified negative impacts need to also be recorded there. So I've mentioned additionality already a couple of times. So what is additionality, and why do we even bother about, why do we even go on about this? So in carbon markets in general, the question is being asked, what justifies the claim that an activity actually reduces emissions? And that's important because it is the key to environmental integrity of carbon benefits being claimed. And carbon benefits being claimed require proof that you really have done good elsewhere. So that's also why carbon already stored in the peatlands is not additional, because it's already there, and it's not something that the carbon finance then has made the difference for. So how do we check for additionality? So we've got 4 additionality tests. So the first one is a legal test. So that one says that there shall not be any legal requirements specifying that the peatlands within the project area must be restored, because then obviously it should happen anyway, and the carbon finance is not additional there. Test 2 and 3 are financial tests, with test 2 saying you need a minimum of 15% of the total project costs to come from carbon finance. So that also says that you can get up to 85% of public funding into your project as well. So it's a blending of public and private finance that's allowed. And test 3 is that it says that without a carbon finance, your project, without carbon finance, the project shall not be the most economically attractive option for the area of land, or shall not be economically viable on that land at all. Test 4 is about other barriers, and you only actually need to check for test 4 if you failed test 3. So other barriers could be any practical, social, or economical or other environmental barriers. So in test 2, I talked about that you need a minimum of 15% carbon finance. So what do we actually mean with carbon finance? So like I said, the carbon units that are coming off these projects are legally for the landowner. It's up to the landowner to decide what they want to do with them. If they want to sell them all initially as pending issuance units, if they want to hold on to them, sell them as verified units later on, or make their own offset claims on them. So with carbon finance, we mean the income for which there's a carbon contract with a third party. So any sales that actually have happened or are planning to happen. It could also mean money that the landowner has invested in the project with a view to personally making offsets, making statements or reporting the carbon. So that's what we also call insetting. So then the landowner invests their own money, but they keep at least 15% of the project cost, and then they can hold on to the carbon to make their own offset claims on, or any planned future sales of carbon by the landowner or the other party which are linked to the predicted emission reductions. You do need to, if you are holding on to units and are not planning to sell them in the future, you then probably have to put in some of your own money initially that you then can come back via the sales of these units later on. Because obviously the carbon units, they will like some of that money, and that depends on how you're splitting your public-private finance there, but that money is meant to go to your project. It's meant to go to your restoration and management of your site, and potentially there's some left over as an income as well. So what kind of costs can come under that additionality rule 2? That minimum 15% over the project, 15% of the project duration. So there's your site survey and preparation, and restoration and management activities for the project duration. Costs that cannot be included into this test is the cost for validation and verification and associated monitoring, other costs related to provision of other facilities, for example, recreation and access, land acquisition or loss of land value, and income foregone are all not included into this test. And that's all clear in the additionality calculator. When you look at that, it shows you where to fill in what. On the test 3, so that's the one that was talking about that without the carbon finance, it would not be the most economically viable, attractive or viable at all. So there's a few more costs that can be included in this one. So it's again site survey and preparation, restoration and management activities for the project duration, but also validation and verification costs, land acquisition, the loss of land value, income foregone, and other costs where these are an integral part of the peatland restoration project. Revenues here include government grants and subsidies, charitable donations, private sources, and other non-government sources, for example, lottery funds. So in carbon markets, we also have to look out for greenhouse gas leakage. So that's so you need to have a declaration of any intention to change the use or management of land elsewhere within your holding. And then if you're doing that, so for example, because you're restoring your land here, you are going to reduce the amount of stock density. You're going to make sure that restoration has success, but then you're going to increase your stock density elsewhere. That's what we call carbon greenhouse gas leakage, because then it could result into damage somewhere else, which could have an impact on the greenhouse gas fluxes elsewhere. So if that's the case, if that's what you're planning to do, then we need to have an assessment made of the impact on greenhouse gas fluxes on the other part of your land. And that needs to be included in our emission calculator. So what kind of statements can people make when they're buying carbon units? So you have to, buyers need to really clearly state the timescale of emission reductions delivery. There's actually quite a lot of companies who are buying pending issuance units at the moment. So those are not verified yet. They're more of an expectation that emission reduction will happen. That hasn't happened yet. But actually, companies can only use or retire these units until after they have been verified. So you get, sorry, excuse me, not make any offset claims on pending issuance units, only on verified carbon units. And projects, they have to make buyers aware of those requirements. So all of this can look possibly a bit daunting and overwhelming, because there is quite a lot that needs to be done and taken into account. So there are quite a few intermediaries working in the area now. Intermediaries can be brokers or project developers or both. So brokers, they are there usually to help you a buyer for your carbon. They all have a different way of working. So some take a percentage of the price of your units. Some take just a fixed fee. So it's definitely worth to speak to a few to get the best deal for you. And then you also have project developers or managers, and they're there to help to fill in all the Peatland Code documents, basically. They usually also have an account on the market registry already, and they manage the project for the whole duration. And some project developers also find a buyer for your carbon if you want to. So with the code, we are experiencing some barriers. So even though we are definitely getting more and more projects, if we're looking at the scale of the problem, we need to scale up, and we need to scale up quickly the number of projects that we have. So there's a few barriers that we have identified which are still there and that we're trying to tackle. So one of the key barriers that we have been told is landowner concern about making enough income, and especially if there's a risk of losing agricultural subsidy by revetting the land. So one of the solutions there is to combine the grants with the code. So like I said, we allow the blended finance of public and private finance, so that helps reduce the cost and the risk to the landowner if you're doing that. So in Scotland, obviously, we've got Peatland Action from Nature Scots, and I'm working closely with Peatland Action to try and align Peatland Code and Peatland Action even better than they are at the moment. But that will be ongoing work for a while. They do work together. And the other one that's really important there is that we need firm assurance from government that agricultural support will apply to recovering and healthy peatlands. So in England, that is now in place. So in the England peat strategy, the English government made it very clear that will be the case. We are pushing and waiting on Scotland to do something similar. So hopefully that will happen, because that will massively help, obviously. Another struggle we've had is that peatlands are actually not that well known. In general, people do understand trees, but obviously not that long ago, we've had the perception that peatlands were wastelands, that they were useless, that we needed to try and drain them to actually make use of them. Now we do know that that was not the best tactic that we had, and that they are actually very useful and important for us. But there are still some misunderstanding around peatlands in general. So that's a fight we're having. Also, what we hear sometimes is people just don't understand and don't see how we can even restore peatlands. Because it took thousands of years to develop. How can we even restore that? So it's a bit of education that we are trying to do at the moment. Another issue that we have, and that is A relevant one is that we are selling avoided emissions and not sequestration. And that has some implications around some companies wanting to go for net zero, and where there is some guidance around that avoided emissions should not be used for that. Luckily, the UK government does accept Peatland Code carbon units and has no indication whatsoever from them that they will stop accepting them. Also, the good thing is with avoided emissions is that there's no risk of reversal. Once emission reduction has happened, it is permanent, so they are less risky. And we are very much working at further landowner engagement, so I'm very happy to be speaking today. So what we're doing in the code is that we're always balancing rigor and simplicity. So it is sometimes a difficult balancing act. So obviously markets demand rigor, companies are risk averse and they lack the expertise to judge which standard or which carbon units would be best and would be safe to invest in. Also, the government demands that any company reporting carbon voluntarily only uses accredited schemes like the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code. And then we've got the other side is that when a code becomes too difficult, it can also be a barrier to landowners, but also to investors to actually use it. So yeah, we're always trying to make that work for both parties, obviously. So the future developments for the code that we've got in store is currently we are working towards achieving UCAS accreditation. So UCAS is UK accreditation body, and they will assess the conformity of the Peatland Code against the international standard for validating and verifying environmental information, so ISO 14065. And then as soon as the code is accredited, then we get our certification bodies who will also work towards achieving UCAS certification. So we're hoping to have that finished by in the start of 2022. And then we're also working on a full version 2 update of the code, which we're hoping will come out in spring 2022. And this will then include fence, and also we are updating our emission factors to the latest scientific evidence. Forest to bulk is probably still a couple of years down the line. So I'll now talk you through an example of how do you actually go through the process of the code, how does it work, and what kind of numbers, what are we looking at. So this diagram is also on our website, so I'm just putting it up here so you know it's there, you're aware of it. I'm not going to speak through it, but it shows you when you need to do which steps, basically, and when you get your units, and when you can sell them, and all of that. So this is an example of a project map with all the assessment units. So this is a real project. You can look at IHS Markit on the Peatland Code. I'll probably pronounce that wrong, so I'm really sorry about that. And if you go to that project, so that the name is at the top, you will see that project map. So they followed our field protocol, so they've mapped every single Hagg and Gully. You can see the orange and the purple lines, and they also mapped all the ditches. Then they've mapped the drain buffers around these features, and they also mapped the actively eroding flat bare area. The important thing, they've also got a grid a grid reference on there, and the name of the project is on there. So you need those two on your map when you upload them onto IHS Markit. So from that map, you then get you can work out your hectares for each of these assessment units. So these are two tables screenshotted from our emission calculator that you can find on our website. And you can see here, this project had almost 0.4 hectares of actively eroding flat bare. That will then move into the drained category. 2.8 hectares of actively eroding haggs and gullies. That will move also in the drained category. Almost 62 hectares of drained artificial. That will move into modified. Almost 46 hectares of drained haggs and gullies will move into modified. And then they've also mapped another 67 hectares of modified, but modified is not an eligible baseline category, so that will not move into another, so they will not get actually any carbon credits for that. So this project has a project length of 35 years. So this is a table 6 from the emission calculator. So they have manually adjusted that is only showing the 35 years. And you can see here that the total emission reduction for this project is 8,724 tons of CO2 equivalents. Then it takes off 10% for the risk buffer, so that's the 1,309 tons of CO2 goes into our risk buffer. And then the emission reduction that the project can claim is 7,415 tons of CO2 equivalent. So before this table, there's another table in emission calculator that also takes off 10% of position buffer. So that's just to make sure that we are absolutely confident in the carbon credits that we are selling. So we take that position buffer off before we calculate the actual claimable units. So I'm now going to talk you through the additionality calculator. So that's, you can also find this template on our website. And this is the top of the calculator. So you fill in your project name, project ID that you get from IHS Markit, the date of when you filled in the calculator, who filled it in, when the restoration begins, your project area, the duration of your project, and your total net claimable emission reductions. So you can see here that's at 7,415. So that came from the previous slides from the emission calculator. What the additionality calculator does for you after you filled in everything, it checks your test 2 and your test 3 of the additionality tests. So your test 2 is that your project passes test 2 if there's no more than 85% of the total cost is funded publicly. So you can see for this project, the grant funding is just over 58%, and the carbon finance that's required is almost 42%. So they've passed test 2. And your test 2 is that your project is not economically viable without your carbon finance. And for that, you need to show that you're excluding your carbon. You've got a negative number there. So they've also passed that one. I have, for the purpose of this training, I've just added another line in here, left over, I've called it. So this project actually, after they've paid for the cost, they have just under £56,000 left over as income for this project. So if you scroll down on your additionality calculator, that's where you then fill in all your restoration, management and maintenance costs. So you can see here this project filled in all the costs for sphagnum, moss, cotton grass planting, reprofiling of your Haggs and gullies, maintenance of the dams, and then there's actually, like, you can fill that in for the whole project duration, so you can fill it for every year. So if you're planning on doing maintenance at year 20, you fill that in at year 20. And then you get a subtotal of your project cost. You also fill in the Peatland Code cost, so your validation and verification and registry fees. So the registry fee is just the setting up of your unit, so that's 6p per unit here. These costs are not included in test 2, but the additionality calculator does that for you. And if you have any other costs, you also fill that in here. So it works out a total cost for you, and then you also fill in your income. So this project has a public funding funder that funds just under £70,000, and then their carbon finance. They are planning on selling their carbon at year 2, and we ask you here to put in a realistic number for your carbon, a realistic number for today, because we do not know what the carbon price will do in the future. So currently, PRUs for the peatlands are getting between 15 and 25 pounds. So I've filled in here £15 per credit, and I've said we will sell them all at year 2. So I've multiplied my total number of units that was at the top. So that's 7,400 something, number times 15. And then that's the income that I will get from my carbon finance. And I will work out your total income here. So the other thing that we ask you to fill in is a project design document. So part of it is filling in like your emission calculator, so copying some tables from the emission calculator, from your additionality calculator, but also your risk assessment is linked to asking consultation, evidence, like just like the overall project plan basically is what you have to fill in here. And then for achieving your project validation, so within 3 years of registering your project on IHS Markit, you need to get your project validation. Ideally, you get your project validation before you start any work on site. But if you have a really tight schedule between getting your funding and having to have diggers on site, there is an exemption that you could take if you want to, is as long as your project is registered on IHS Markit, you could start your work on site. However, you will then obviously have to hand in really good baseline evidence of your project, so the independent validator can still check your baseline. So that could be, for example, drone imagery, satellite imagery, fixed point photographs, that kind of evidence, so they can really clearly see your baseline condition. If you start at work and the validator needs more evidence of your baseline, then obviously that will be very difficult. So there's a risk to starting your restoration before you've got project validation, but it is an option if you really have to. So you apply to the Peatland Code to one of the Peatland Code approved certification bodies to get your project validation. So that's either Organic Farmers and Growers or Soil Association, and then you submit your project design document, your restoration and management plan, your maps, your emission calculator, your additionality calculator, your risk your risk assessment. So all your documents you hand in, you submit them to the certification body. So then there will be either a remote or so a desk-based check of your baseline. So that's if you have enough baseline evidence, or they will decide they need an in-person site visit to check your baseline is exactly what you said it will, what is. So then there will be a time frame set within you will have to submit any corrective actions if there's any. So it could be, so it's not that project validation is a yes or no. If they have some questions or issues with any of your plans, they will come back to you and you have a chance to change what you need to change. So if that's all then in place, you will get your project validation statement issued, and if you want to, you can get all your pending issuance units set up for your full project duration at that point. So then you will usually carry out your restoration, so do everything you set in your restoration plan that you will do. And then within 3 years post receiving project validation and within 1 year post of finishing restoration is when you need to get your restoration validated. So you need to notify the certification body and the Peatland Code Registry of your start date. So that's the date on which restoration activities were fully completed. You will then need to arrange a site visit with the independent validator. So this is always an in-person site visit. And you hand in any evidence of restoration. So for example, pre and post restoration pictures. And if that's all in place, you will get your restoration validation statement issued. So during your whole project, you will ask to monitor your condition category change, so via field surveys. So at year 1, year 5, and then every 10 years is when the independent validator verifier will do this for you. And they will determine condition category that are present. So they check, is it revegetated? Is your actively eroding area revegetated? And is your drained area now into modified. And if necessary, they will ask you to do any remedial restoration activities if you have to. We also ask you to check to do any monitoring in between. So it's obviously important that if anything is failing, that you notice that in time, so you can actually do something and change and make take any remedial action if you need to. So then at year 5 is when our first verification happens, and then afterwards is every 10 years. So you need to agree a date for year 5 verification. So there's a field visit required at every verification. And then there will be, if there's anything that's not in order, then you will get a time frame within you need to take any remedial action if that's necessary. And then if everything is in order, you will get issued your verification statement, and you will get your PIUs of year 0 to year 5 verified in the Peatland carbon units. And then if it's year 15, it's obviously year 0 to year 15 that's then verified. Right, that was all the information that I was going to chat you through. And I will now take any questions. Thank you very much.